All right, it's recording.
Okay. Well, this is an interview with Tom Albinson, the president of International Association for Refugees. And Tom, I very much appreciate your doing this and sharing your experience and your expertise with our audience. So maybe as a way to begin, I'd just like to invite you to introduce yourself and tell us some about the work you do and how you got into this.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's good to be with you guys. So my name's Tom Albinson. Basically, what happened to me, it was all by accident. In fact, it's hard to find someone working with refugees that was dreaming of doing that before they started. It's like most of us fell into this thing, and we're all grateful. Once you get into this kind of work, you don't want to leave it. But for me, it all started back in 1980. I was a social work major. I had just finished college with a BSW, and I thought I'd do a 6-month short-term mission experience after I graduated and then carry on with my life plan to do mental health work in an urban context. And while I was doing a short-term missions project, I was based in Austria. The leaders of the project heard about a refugee camp there, and they asked me to go out and find it and see if we could get in and see what we might be able to do. This was not on the radar of most missions, so we had no idea what we were doing. We walked into the camp. We struck up friendships with people. We were shocked at how open they were. They were just like, come on in. The work I was doing was related to the unofficial exportation of scriptures into communist countries. And so we had lots of Bibles in different languages. So we just asked refugees in the camp there who had all their basic needs taken care of, all of whom had fled from communist countries at the time. We just asked them, hey, do you want a Bible? And it was amazing because they'd grab me by the neck, literally sit me down at a table, get all their friends, find a translator, open the Bible, and literally just say, tell us what it means. So that was pretty shocking. I didn't know you could do that. And anyway, so I went back. I thought I'd carry on with my life after those 6 months. And I felt the unmistakable calling of God in my life. He said, go back to this little village that wasn't even on a map in Austria, where there was this big refugee camp. And he said, go back there and work with refugees. And I told him, I said, I'm happy to do it, but no organization I know works with refugees, no mission, including the one that had sent me out there. They were doing other kinds of work. And so I just told him, I don't even know how to do that. So after about 6 weeks of prayer and wrestling with God over that mission called me up and asked me if I'd go start a work. So again, I had no idea what I was doing. I do feel like my social work degree was a really good prep for it. It gave me a lot of tools in sociology and psychology that were very, very helpful to figure out kind of what might it look like to engage in this place. And so that's where I started, 1980, working with people from Eastern Europe.
Let me just ask you about that, because I'm interested when you said that it wasn't on anybody's radar.
Right.
And mission organizations generally, not just in Austria, but generally just were not paying attention to refugees.
No, you're right. It was nothing. It was not part of missions. And I would dare say that it hasn't been part of missions in the mind of most people in churches until about 2015. That's when some churches and some organizations started to say, hey, we should be doing something with refugees.
That just is remarkable to me. Did something happen about 2015 that changed things?
Yeah, a whole lot of things happened. So in 2015, most of us will remember there was a photo of a young boy who had died and washed ashore on the Turkish coastline. He was part of the Great Migration out of Turkey to Greece. That got so much media attention. And that photo woke people up to the level of crisis that the world's in today related to forced displacement. So at that point, people said, we have to do something. And we actually started to get phone calls at that time saying, what can we do? Which that had never happened from churches until that point. There was another shift that happened in 2015 shortly after that. So that was in the summer, I think August or September of 2015. And then in November of 2015, there was an attack on Paris, a terrorist attack. And the media quickly speculated that November that a person who may have come as a refugee to Europe may have been involved in that. And that was the first time I heard the word terrorist and refugee used in the same sentence. I was sitting in the Istanbul airport at the time watching my Facebook feed light up with people talking about how dangerous refugees were. Up until then, everybody looked at refugees as people to be pitied. Beginning in November 2015, they began to be people who may be dangerous and therefore a threat. And so then there was another shift, and a lot of, including Christians, a lot of people shifted their posture towards refugees, to whom they'd been sympathetic, to being, well, we have to protect ourselves first. Meanwhile, there was another movement that said, no, we have to actually reach out to these people with good news of Jesus and with demonstrations of his love for them. Yeah. So, and now we're in that space that's kind of unfurled since then.
Yeah, remarkable. We'll come back to that because that is such an important issue. Mm-hmm. But staying with kind of the development of your involvement with refugees, let me circle back to that. I was just struck by that comment about lack of attention to refugees. Mm-hmm. So along the way then, you formed the International Association for Refugees. Did that come much later or sooner in history?
Yeah, so I worked with two classical mission organizations in the 80s and then in the 90s into the into 2009, basically. And God bless those organizations for even thinking about refugees, because very few were. But I realized over that period of time that a lot of normal mission organizations are not well equipped or set up to engage in humanitarian space as mission agencies. And so in 2009, I founded International Association for Refugees as an interdenominational Christian mission designed for ministry and access into refugee contexts.
So you used a couple of terms there that I want to expand on a little bit. First, you referred to a classical mission organization or refugee organization. What does that mean? What's a classic organization?
So what I consider a classic mission organization.
Yeah.
So this is my opinion. I'm full of opinions, as Dr. Bowen knows. So my opinion is that most mission organizations create their strategies around geographical areas or around specific people groups, language groups, or religious groups. So you hear about things like the 1040 window, or you hear about people reaching into the Muslim community, or you hear about people doing urban ministry, something like that. Refugees don't fit any of those categories because by definition, a refugee is a person on the move. And they're also people in a humanitarian crisis. And that is not generally where missions happens, is in those contexts. And then they're also in an international space quite often. So they're in a space that often includes either governmental or United Nations and non-governmental gatekeepers around them, primarily to provide for their physical needs and their security. And so a lot of missions don't understand the ins and outs of that kind of space that refugees inhabit.
So that international context and the fact that they're under the auspices of the UN, that complicates things for a lot of mission organizations who might want to engage with them?
Yeah, because it doesn't, if you're going to go in and church plant, it's pretty hard to just knock on the door of the UN and say, hey, this is what we want to do. And there's reasons for that we could get into if you want to.
Sure. And as we have seen in the past, it's a good way to get arrested if you do try to do that.
Yeah, you can even get in trouble, and it might be not necessary to actually land yourself in that kind of difficulty. I'm not judging the person that you're referring to, but there's ways you can access that space as a Christian without a lot of restrictions put on you. Yeah. You just have to understand the space that you're working in. You basically have to contextualize, right?
Yeah. So for yourself in your own ministry work, you talked about that early experience in Austria. You had been bringing Bibles and Bible study materials, I assume, into communist countries. And but you also referred to your BSW being good preparation. So what kinds of things are you doing in a ministry to refugees, in addition to Bibles and study materials?
Yeah. So again, because you're in a humanitarian space, that means that people are struggling just to survive physically. They've been ripped out of their former homes and contexts. So they're dealing with existential needs, but they're also dealing with needs related to hope and keeping hope alive. Even if they are breathing and fairly well fed, they still have to figure out, well, where can I go from here? And so accessing that kind of space, I felt like my studies in sociology and stuff gave me the tools to to try to understand or to seek to understand a people group, a societal structure, including looking at how does a refugee context work. They are different if you're in a refugee camp or if you're in an urban context where often refugees are not gathered together, but 60% of the world's refugees are in urban environments, not in camps, which a lot of people don't know. And then you've got people who are living in detention centers and facilities. And then you've got people wandering the streets, unable to work, unable to access social services in countries like the US while they're waiting for their asylum request to be processed. And so you've got a lot of different contexts. And I felt like my studies helped me prepare ways to analyze, evaluate, and assess kind of what's going on in that environment, and then understand the subgroups within which the refugees live. So they have their own communities inside of these environments that they depend on for survival. So I felt like that was really helpful. And then the psych piece came in helpful because everyone who's been forcibly displaced has been traumatized. It is traumatic to be forced to flee your home and your homeland. And so just to get some basic tools, I need more, but just some basic tools to understand how people may be processing that, and to be aware of trauma, and to be aware of other mental illness issues that may be complicating the environment for everyone, the people operating the environment, the refugee camp or the refugee context, but also for the refugees themselves. Mm-hmm. So I felt like it was a good foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're the social worker, I'm not, but I think that social work pays more attention to systems, communities, populations, and so that was an important preparation for you in order to assist refugees. Yeah, very good. So let's talk a little bit about refugees. Who are they? You know, what happens to a refugee? What are the different ways people become refugees? Let's talk a little bit about what their lives are like.
That's really good. So I'm going to build out a little bit so that we understand who we're talking about. And I'm going to go with the word forcibly displaced people just for a moment. So in the big picture of things, you have human migration, and people migrate for all kinds of different reasons, usually for economic reasons. But forcibly displaced people are a subset of migrants, and they're people who've been forced to flee not because of climate issues or earthquakes, volcanoes, or tsunamis and stuff. Forcibly displaced people that we're talking about here are people who've been forced to flee due to human causes. And so forcibly displaced people, and this would be the definition or the way the United Nations would use the term as well. These people are people who've had to flee because of war, because of failed states, because of gross violations of human rights, or because of persecution for their religious, ethnic, or other identity in their country of origin. So then within that group of forcibly displaced people who are running because of man-made causes, you've got the biggest group, which is about 40 million people today, who have been forced to flee their homes but not their country. So most people don't want to flee their country, so they flee somewhere safe within the borders of their country. And those are called internally displaced people, or IDP. That's, again, the biggest group because nobody wants to leave their country if they didn't have to. The next group of people would be refugees, of which now there are about 25.5 million people. These numbers are staggering. But these are people who've been forcibly displaced from their home and their country. So they've crossed an international border, find themselves in another country, and they're seeking refuge, which basically means safety. So they flee. Most people obviously flee to a neighboring country. And so most refugees are found in the developing world. So most of the refugees, 85% in fact, are found in some of the poorer countries in the world. They carry the lion's share of refugees who've been forced to flee their country. There's also people called asylum seekers, and we hear about them primarily in the context of Europe, but we also hear them here in the U.S., here in the U.S., when we hear about the people coming from the Northern Triangle, which would include Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, those three countries. And we hear about people who are fleeing across the border in Mexico into the U.S. asking for asylum. So those people are people who claim to be refugees but have not yet been given the status. So they too are outside of their country of origin. They're seeking protection in another country. They make their own way to another country where they ask for that protection. And then the country has to rule on whether or not these people have a bona fide qualifying reason to be considered a refugee.
So, Tom, I could hear people might ask, are refugees then illegal immigrants when they just cross a border into another country?
Yeah, I've never heard that before. So sadly, people are sloppy with words, and in the world of words, words matter. And when it comes to people who are fleeing their countries, they really matter. So what most of us probably haven't sat down and read the amazing document drafted in response to World War II called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then Article 14, it's not that long a document, so I highly recommend reading it. Article 14 says that every human being has the right to seek asylum in another country if they're fearing for their life or if they're fearing for their freedom of movement, which means they're either going to be killed or they're going to be imprisoned because of something that they believe, or an ethnicity or a religious viewpoint that they may have in their country of origin. So we have the human right to flee. That means it's not illegal to cross a border. There was another document drawn up also in response to World War II called the Protocol of the Refugee Convention. And the Refugee Convention, these things can all be downloaded online. The Refugee Convention goes into greater detail, and in its prelude, it actually states that we understand that when somebody's running for their life, they may not be able to cross a border legally. They may not use, they may not have the proper documents. They may not be able to access through an established border. They may even resort to using people to assist them in crossing a border. And these things, when you're running for your life, are not considered illegal. They're considered a necessary evil that people need to access in order to find safety. So that would mean that people who cross a border, because they're running for their life, have not broken those laws to which the U.S. has signed the documents. Our country, and I think, I can't remember the number, 100 and some plus countries in the world have signed both of these documents, recognizing that this might be necessary for people to do in search.
So just to clarify, the United Nations wrote the Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, I think was that declaration. And it's not simply the United Nations declaring this, but members, including the United States, support that and agree to that. So the United States acknowledges those rights.
Right. Signed our names to it, to both of those documents. And we have to remember, I think context is important to remember, these things were drafted in response to World War II because we recognized, we turned away literally shiploads of people who had left Europe running for their lives from the Nazi regime, and the U.S. included, turned away many of these people, forcing them to go back, many of whom then died or were incarcerated because of their ethnic identity as Jews back in Nazi Germany. And so the world said, we cannot let that happen again. We have to learn from our mistakes, and that's what this was drawn up for. The world's come a long ways. We're now really testing whether we believe in these rights or not in the political landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important context. So we're talking about universal rights that countries recognize and are expected then to respect those rights and protect people. So that's very helpful, a really important distinction. So do refugees mainly come out of Africa, or where are refugees coming from?
That's really good too. There's a map on our website you might want to download. It highlights the 10 main refugee-producing countries in the world. It's called the Refugee Highway. You can download that from our toolbox on IAFR.org. But if you look at that, it breaks down where refugees are. Now, words, again, are really important. So we're focused on refugees, people who are outside of their borders seeking protection or refugee status. 31% of the world's refugees are in sub-Saharan Africa. So the largest number of refugees are there. Now, when we listen to the news, most of us think the lion's share of refugees are in the Middle East, but the reality is they're actually in sub-Saharan Africa. Asia also has a large number of refugees, as does the Middle East and North Africa. So that's where the majority are. There's also more than people think in Europe, because Ukraine belongs to Europe. So there's a lot of Ukrainians who've been forcibly displaced as well. So of all the world's refugees, 3% are in North and South America combined.
Yeah, interesting, because we do think of a lot of people coming into North America, but it's really a very small number.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are people who find themselves then in camps or kind of dispersed within an urban environment.
Yeah.
And they are then supported by the United Nations and the World Food Program. So what does that mean? They get food and shelter?
Yeah, so again, the United Nations World Food Program, those international organizations, they're working primarily in the developing world context. If you move up into the European areas where refugees are found, that's generally left for the European governments to resolve together. So in the EU, they don't get a lot of help from the UN. And that's an important distinction. But when you do get into the developing world, and again, 85% of the world's refugees are in that area of the world. That is where the United Nations and the World Food Program and the International Organization for Migration and those organizations work together with the agenda of keeping people physically alive.
And just to come back to the distinction between a refugee and an IDP, the UN does not work with the IDPs then, is that right?
Well, they would like to, and they consider them part of their people of concern, but internally displaced people are very complicated to work with because quite often they're displaced because of reasons associated with their government. And that means that government may not be very interested in letting outside institutions access their country to help their internally displaced people. So if there's a civil war, or if there is persecution going on and things, those countries generally don't want the assistance of international organizations like the UN. In some cases, they do. But in most cases, internally displaced people are far less served and cared for than refugees because they're much more difficult to access. So the short answer to your question is the UN does not do much with internally displaced people because they're so hard to access.
Mm-hmm. So to use one example, the internally displaced people's camp in Kakuma, they're under the auspices of the Kenyan government, and the Kenyan government then provides some basic assistance to them.
That would be nice. Yeah. So yeah, it's 2,000 people in a place. I know you've been there. The Kenyan government actually just told the people where they had to live. So they opened a place called the West Turkana IDP camp, and it's in a place that doesn't have water, doesn't have electricity, doesn't have anything. You can't even drill for water there because there's no water where they are. But they told them where they could be, so they gave them land, I guess, in that sense. Then the people had to build their own shelters. They had to do everything else for themselves until about 2014, I think it was, or 2015. So these people came to that area in 2007. So it was about 7 years or so later when the government said we should probably build a few shelters for those people. So they built 100 shelters for the 2,000 people or so. Outside organizations have been trying to help them as well. But most of the people in Kakuma are there to serve the refugee population, not the internally displaced population, and their funding is earmarked for that. So again, they have difficulty having the resources to help people that they know are in great, great need.
Mm-hmm. And so is it a fair generalization to say that refugees have some basic support, especially in the developing world, through the work of the United Nations, the World Food Program? Internally displaced people, it's a much more challenging situation, typically less support, more difficult living circumstances.
Yep, well put. Whoa, yeah. I've got some killer sunlight there.
So tell us a little bit about the refugee life. What's it like for a person who becomes a refugee?
Yeah, so, it's very hard to generalize this stuff, obviously, but I'll do it as long as everybody understands it's super general.
Mm.
And let's go to a camp. So in a refugee camp context, for one, you're really glad when you get to a refugee camp at the beginning because you finally got security, you've got safety, generally speaking, compared to what you were experiencing. And security is like the number one human need, to feel safe. You'll do almost anything if you don't feel safe to find safety. And so they get that, but very shortly after you arrive in a refugee camp, you begin to realize there's no way out. The world offers three solutions to forced displacement: go home, integrate where you are, or be resettled to another country. But none of those options are really working. In any given year, in a really good year, maybe 3% of the world's refugee population finds a solution to their displacement. We're not in a really good year.
Uh,
It's probably closer to 1% of the world's refugee population that's finding a solution. And refugees live, therefore, with a sense of feeling stuck in a space, not in a place. So refugee camps are spaces, not places. You cannot be from a refugee camp. Refugee camps, by definition, are temporary, and everything around you tells you that. The houses are often made out of either the leaves and the brush in the area or the mud in the area. They're not permanent structures. The transportation system, the water systems, everything that is helping keep people alive, everything's made with a sense of temporariness around it, and the upkeep is not strong. So everything that these people experience every day says they have to leave someday, but there's no way out. And that internal dissonance eats away at people. And if many people are now born in refugee camps into families in which the last relative to have seen their country of origin is a grandparent. So that means you get 3 generations of people in a refugee camp, 2 of which have never seen the country that people say they're from. So they're getting further and further away from the ability to ever return to a place that's familiar. The only life they know is in a world of humanitarian aid, often with very limited access to employment or education or anything else. And so hope starts to erode. Plus then just the living conditions. Refugee camps in general are not built in nice places. They're built in places where nobody wants to live. So in floodplains and deserts or semi-deserts and in really difficult places where just surviving is hard. And so people struggle with hope. For them, it's not an abstraction. It's a tangible reality.
Yeah. If I could come back just a second to that 1% number. So that's not 1% go live in other countries. That's in total either go home, incorporate where you are, or be resettled. That's in total only 1% of all refugees get to do one of those 3 things. That
would be in the last 2 years, yeah.
Yeah, it used to be up to 3%, but it's dropped down to about 1%.
So what was bad is worse. In the words of someone I heard in a United Nations forum, the big problem in our world today is to create space in the hearts and minds of people for refugees. That if there's not any space for these people in our hearts and minds, there will not be physical space available in our countries either. We're going to vote them out. And as the world's refugee population or forcibly displaced people population has increased by 50% since 2007, so there's more and more forcibly displaced people in the planet. 1 in every 110 people alive right now is forcibly displaced. 44,000 people are newly displaced every day. As more and more every day, yeah. So that's basically 1 every 2 seconds, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe every second now. But as these people are forcibly displaced more and more, there's less and less space available for them to find refuge. That's been happening for over 10 years now. And the world has really pushed that to the brink. And that's why a lot of people are calling this a global refugee crisis. we don't know what to do.
And would it be fair to say that in their country of origin, that country is moving on? People are moving on, and so they're losing that original connection to their home communities. Maybe they had property in those communities. Other people have moved into that space now. And so there, in a sense, is no longer a place for them back in that.
Exactly. And then also often the population that did not flee views anyone who returns with suspicion. I know that's the case in places even like Rwanda, which you don't hear a lot about anymore, but it's also definitely the situation in Syria today, or even in the Ukraine. If you fled, why did you flee? Were you a part of the wrong side of the genocide, or were you working for the people for the wrong side? And sometimes governments don't want people to come back who they believe were working for the wrong side of whatever conflict happened. And so returning, you're right, with time, there's all kinds of factors, including the ones you mentioned, and others that make it really, really hard to go back the longer you're out.
And so refugees are just, in a sense, stuck being long-term residents of a camp?
Yeah, and they know. So we also work in a camp in Malawi, and the government's constantly threatening to close the camp or to move it hundreds of miles away from where they are today, and the refugees themselves have no voice in the matter. So they never know, you know, let's say you're a Christian. So a lot of Christians are refugees, and inside of refugee camps, you'll find a lot of refugee churches and stuff. So again, because the environments are hot and tough, you can't just meet outside. And in some of these camps, there's not even a tree to meet under in the shade from the blistering sun. And so they need a building. Well, even if you're going to build your church building out of the mud around you, it still costs money, especially to get a decent roof over your head. And these guys have to decide, do we build or not, when we know somebody in some office somewhere could hit the delete button any day and that space is gone. It's not their space. And they may have to move somewhere else and then rebuild up there. And they live with this unbelievable uncertainty because these spaces are not guaranteed. They're subject to the whim of politicians and even international policy. And then they don't have the ability to go home. And the very, very, very few people get resettled to another country from a refugee camp in any given year.
And so given what you're describing, what happens to refugees over time, emotionally, spiritually, physically?
Well, I know it should happen. I mean, if it was me, I would crumble myself up in a ball and cry in a corner somewhere of my mud house, feeling like there's no reason to live. The reality is some people do completely break down and are overwhelmed with depression. The suicide rates in refugee camps are going up right now because there's so few opportunities for them to have a life beyond where they are. Some of the people stop feeling human. They tell me that. They feel dehumanized. And so what people end up doing to try to survive or make the best out of their own situations, many resort to prostitution. Others marry off their children to old men. There's all kinds of things they do to try to make their situation better. But the more they move down that path, the less and less they feel humanized themselves. And so the whole family unit, the clan units, everything start to break down. On the bright side, there's other people, and I would dare say it might be the majority from just observation, who get up every day and say, I'm going to make the best out of my day today. And some of them come up and they form little organizations to help the most vulnerable people in the refugee community. So I find refugees, and this is really important, refugees are more than people in need. Often when we hear about them, and even everything I've just told you, could lead someone to believe that these are just people in need. The reality is they are part of the solution to their own problem. And I find leaders and I find regular moms and kids who are forming community-based organizations within refugee camps to solve specific problems that they're confronted with, whether it's to create an elementary school or a preschool, or whether it's to create an association of people around their faith in Jesus, perhaps, like I mentioned to you, well, I probably haven't on this call, but there's a group of 157 churches in one refugee camp of almost 200,000 people. 157 churches are working together. And together they're working with the youth. Together they're working on peace and reconciliation. Together they're working on spreading the good news of Jesus. They're doing all kinds of stuff that help people keep hope alive. Because if your physical needs are met, but you don't have hope, you may well prefer to be dead. And so the refugees themselves work to keep hope alive.
Yeah, yeah. I want to stay with that really important point that you're making. So it sounds like the most effective kinds of help are not simply coming in and giving things to refugees, but actually helping them to build lives in that context.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so kind of facilitating and assisting, but they're developing the solution. You know, they're identifying problems and working to solve them.
Yeah, and it's important with that comment to just remember that what the humanitarian world is doing to keep people physically alive is nothing short of amazing. They do great work, and people need to have those basic physical needs met. Mm-hmm. But more is needed. And the humanitarian world has actually come to the faith-based world at the forum of the United Nations. And they've said, you know, we're doing a fairly good job of keeping people alive. But there's more that's needed for people to recover from their forced displacement. So they're helping people survive, but how do you help them recover? And they said, this is when we get into issues of healing. We get into issues of hope. And they said, we think that strength is in the domain of faith-based organizations, including the church. Mm-hmm. And so you need both. And from the faith-based side, I think partnering with refugees is definitely the best way to go. Getting behind their ideas. You keep people physically alive in different ways than you facilitate and strengthen hope within a community. And one of the ways that you strengthen hope is by getting behind their ideas and their solutions.
Yeah. Would you have an example, perhaps, of a local church or group of churches that have done what you're talking about?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you just loaded that one, so tee it up. So in the Kakuma refugee camp in remote northwestern Kenya, again, there's 200,000 people. I get there 3 times a year, so I got a lot of potential stories there. But one of the things that they're doing up there that's quite remarkable is these 157 churches have come together. And one of the things they do every year is plan and implement a refugee youth camp. So they pull together 200 to 250 of their youth. They can't get them all together because of costs. They bring as many, and because of the capacity of the places in the camp. But they get them all together for about 4 days. And during that time, they have fun. They do things that you would do at camp. But they also do a lot based on Scripture. And they talk about issues of hope. They talk about human sexuality. They talk about peace and reconciliation and forgiveness. They bring people together, young people together, from tribes that may be at war less than 100 miles away with each other. But in the camp, they're helping these guys realize that they can transcend their ethnic identity. They can transcend those by their common faith in Jesus. And so, you know, that camp does all kinds of things to strengthen faith, build peace, and also just give these kids something to look forward to every year. So that's one way. Another thing that, you know, we've worked on together that I think is quite important is that the refugee leader said, one of the things we need is theological training, because they're cut off now from opportunities to continue to develop their skills and their thinking and their theology and their pastoral training. And they've said, everybody in our churches are traumatized. We need to understand trauma. We need to figure out as churches, how do we become healing communities? And so that's where they've reached out to the church at large. In this case, it would be Wheaton College. And they said, could you guys work with us to help us develop that capacity? And that was a partnership that they initiated that's going strong today. Mm-hmm. And the refugees have also created then a school. They call it the Kakuma Interdenominational School of Mission. The mission of that school is to reach the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ from Kakuma And they have graduated over 1,000 people who are now in Europe and Australia and the US and Canada and in different countries in Africa, some of which even returned home. And they are now pastoring and doing things. So when you go to a graduation ceremony, they generally break a big smile, remember their mission together and say, see, we're doing it. And so that gives them incredible hope and a sense of we are able to have a life full of meaning and purpose as we serve the kingdom of God together. And that's been a phenomenal thing to strengthen as well.
Yeah, that's a remarkable story. How about a church or group of churches in the U.S.? If they decide we would like to have some kind of ministry to refugees, what do they do?
Yeah, that's really good too. So the U.S. context is different. Now, if we're talking refugees, about 2 years ago, I would have told you, talk to a refugee resettlement agency, which many of our cities have. If you know of World Relief, that would be a great one to contact if they're in your area, which I believe in Boise they are. And I know they're in Minneapolis, where I am, in Chicago, and different places. So you can talk to them and ask them if they can connect you with a refugee or a refugee family that's recently arrived in the U.S. The refugees that I know here in the U.S. tell me that while a lot of churches and a lot of organizations actually do help them by stocking their kitchens, helping them find apartments, helping them connect for employment or language learning, help them figure out the school system, those things are all super important. But when I talk to the refugees who've been resettled here, the number one need they tell me they have is isolation from the greater community. Mm-hmm. And what they really want and what they really need and what nobody seems to think is worth their time right now is to go visit them and enjoy their hospitality and to reciprocate by inviting them into your space, into your home. It comes back to Matthew 25. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Jesus actually packages that right in the middle of I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was sick and you came and visited me. I was in jail and you visited me. I mean, right in the middle of that thing where he's addressing the core needs of a human being. He says, I was a stranger and you invited me in. And that, in my opinion, is what every church should excel at. And Jesus, in his opinion too, apparently, he said, these are the things that will mark my followers. And hospitality is really, really important. But not only the hospitality where we invite them into our space, as valuable as that is, not only us feeding them our strange food, but to actually go into their space and receive their hospitality. Most cultures find great joy in giving hospitality to others. So that's something churches can do. The key there is just to get connected to them.
Yeah, and building community with them. That's really important.
Yeah.
I want to shift to another type of organization, just thinking about groups working with refugees. And one is the Refugee Highway Partnership. Could you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so the Refugee Highway Partnership is an organization that doesn't exist on paper. What it is, a global network of individuals, churches, and Christian agencies that are all serving forcibly displaced people. And it had its first meeting in 2001 in Izmir, Turkey, where we just found as many people as we could who were working with refugees, and we called them all together, and we had representatives from Red Cross and the UN and a whole lot of organizations, plus just individuals who were serving tea to refugees in parks in Italy and stuff. And we all came together to see if there is stuff we might be able to do together that we couldn't do alone. And that happened under the umbrella of World Evangelical Alliance. That has since 2001 grown into having active regions, the most active regions being right now North America, which would be Canada and the US, Europe, which is very active, the Middle East. There's an emerging South Asia and an emerging South American, Central American region as well. And Africa is struggling. There's a lot of challenges in bringing people together in that context. So we're still trying to figure it out. But there's a desire for that to happen in that context. And basically what happens is once a year in each of these regions, everyone who is interested comes together in one place, shares what they're learning, shares what they're struggling with. There's opportunities for training and workshops and in plenary sessions, but then just a whole lot of space to hear what else is going on so that we can learn from each other's experiences. And it's all in the context saturated in worship and prayer as well. So that's actually quite unique and beautiful as well.
So for example,
American one in Chicago at the end of October this year. And if you want to know more about it, you can go to refugeehighway.net. And that should give you links to where different regional things are happening. The Europe region gets together in February's. They often have 22, 23 countries represented in their midst, as they also network together, because a refugee who's in Italy today might be in France tomorrow and in Sweden next week. Or even a refugee who's here in the US may be in Canada in a few weeks. So there's a lot of movement of people. And so building up that network is also really important, so that the church can show up at every stage along the journey of a forcibly displaced person. That's our real hope.
So is that something, for example, a meeting in Chicago, if there's a person who just wants to know more about working with refugees, wants some education and so on, could they attend a meeting like that?
Oh yeah, it's open and it's fantastic. It'd be a great place to go learn more. If you've got the ability to go, highly recommend it.
Let's shift for a moment. There are, as you know very well, you live in the midst of this, some controversies around refugees coming particularly into the US. And so one of those, for example, that you sometimes hear from people is that these they're not contributing to the country. They're just a burden on our welfare system. Our tax dollars are going to them, and the country is really not getting anything in return. How do you respond when you hear somebody share an idea like that?
Yeah. I can't separate out my being a Christian from what I think, which is probably a good thing. I feel like I have to speak from a faith-integrated place. And for one, I think we are really moving into dangerous territory when we put a value on people based on their economic contribution. If we value people less, if we hold them as Christians to not have an economic status or a capacity to contribute to the greater society, I don't believe that reflects the Jesus we follow. I don't believe it reflects the values of his word. However, I understand pragmatically that this is one of the questions that's out there in society, and it must be talked about. So there have been countless studies that demonstrate that refugees within 7 years of their arrival are producing more, they're giving back more to society than they're taking from it. Of course, when they get here, they've got nothing. And in the US context, they need help. Most people think they're getting way more help than they're getting. What a lot of people don't know is that if you come from, say, Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, if you are resettled to Boise, Idaho, you've got to pay back your plane ticket to the US government within 10 years. So these people, when they arrive, they start with nothing and in debt. And that plane ticket for one person might be $1,000, but some of these people do come with families, and sometimes as many as 9 kids, will be with a family. And so these people have to figure out a way to start paying back within a few months. When they get here, sometimes they don't know the language. When they get here, sometimes they don't know, well, they obviously don't know some of the skills that you need just to get a job in the US. They don't have a resume. They don't have any referrals. They have to start with literally nothing. So if you only look at the very beginning of their trajectory, obviously they need some help and support. Within 3 months of their arrival, they're supposed to be working and fully engaged in the society around them. That's pretty ambitious, but that's what the government expects of people. We do not have a lot of safety nets for refugees. A lot of refugees, remember, these are traumatized people as well, who weren't prepared. They might have gotten 3 or 4 days of some kind of orientation to American life. I dare you to try to do that. Give somebody a 3-day orientation of what it means to live in America. We're a very complex society here. So they might have gotten something before they came, but just the static of all the years in refugee camps. Many of these people have spent 10, 15, 20, 30 years in a humanitarian context before they ever get here. It would have been far better to get them here far quicker, because then they could adapt without becoming psychologically dependent on humanitarian aid or just that daily struggle with hope. And many of them come to a place like America thinking, oh, finally, I'm going to be okay. And then they realize how much this government expects out of them right away. All to say, there are social services, there are some things that refugees get at the beginning of their time here in the States that may cost us money, but the investment pays off starting after their 7th year or so on average. And so therefore, I would dare say it's like any conversation about money. Sometimes you have to invest in order to receive more later. Any life insurance policy works the same way, right? You pay a lot before you ever start getting anything. And,
Sure.
and in a sense, that's what refugees are. When they come, they tend to do very, very well. Migrants tend to start more businesses than native-born people in the U.S., just in general. So it's not a bad economic investment. However, once again, I come back to saying we as Christians should think long and hard and try to study our scriptures to understand where does the value of a human life come from. And we have to remember the people we're talking about are people who are running for their lives. And they need a solution. And there's only 3 available. And if the richest and most powerful nations in the world do not assist the poorest and weakest countries in the world, what's going to happen? Where does our world go from there?
Yeah, exactly. I'll just ask you one more, and I'm sure you hear this also, especially in the last couple of years, there's been the suggestion that the path through which refugees come into the country is also a path for terrorists, that terrorists can kind of intermingle with refugees, and so we, in a sense, have a great vulnerability by allowing refugees to come in, that we're bringing in terrorists as well.
Right. So, I mean, the short thing is go find a person who was a refugee resettled to the U.S. who committed an act of terrorism. You won't. You may find 2nd or 3rd generation people who have been involved in that, but you won't find refugees. You've got a far greater chance of getting hit by lightning or getting into a car wreck or a whole lot of other things than you do of a refugee becoming a terrorist. These are people who are fleeing often ISIS or fleeing totalitarian countries. They're running for their lives. They're not people coming here to cause harm. However, it is, to be honest, when the world fails to resettle people, I hope I don't get too complicated here. Let's go back to our 200,000 people in the camp in northern Kenya called Kakuma. So if we don't give these people the opportunity to resettle from a refugee camp, they're going to wake up one day and say, I can't take it here anymore with all these uncertainties and with the struggles of life. And they're going to increasingly become willing to risk everything to try to get to a country where they can rebuild their lives. And that's where we increase the number of asylum seekers by decreasing the numbers of people that we resettle. Pragmatically speaking, when you resettle a refugee, when the U.S. resettles a refugee, we vet them like no other country or any other migrant. Refugees go through so many security checks by every branch of our security system repeatedly over at least 2 years, sometimes as long. I know a guy who's went through 14 years of checks, and they kept timing out so they'd have to start all over again. And so you go through incredible checks before you ever come here. While I think it's a little bit extreme, at least what we can see is the U.S., when we resettle refugees, we're choosing who comes, and we're vetting who gets across our borders. By decreasing that number, we're going to see an increase in asylum seekers, and these are people that we did not invite to come, but people who are saying, I have to get to a place where I can actually build a life, where I see a future for my children, is what you'll often hear. So we do ramp up the numbers of people who flee into our country that we don't have any clue about. And now we have to do the vetting after they're here. And that's way more complicated. And so I would say one of the things that this whole conversation leads to is a strong argument to resettle more refugees in order to keep the numbers of asylum seekers lower, because you get to pick and choose. That gives everybody a stronger sense of safety and security in the process. Another thing to say about the process of how people cross our borders. So the resettlement process is government regulated, and we actually pick who comes. The asylum seeker process, so these are people fleeing, doing whatever it takes to get across borders. They generally need to access the services of smuggling organizations. They're mafias, they're underground, they're criminal organizations that make their money by people paying them to help to get across a border, or even for safety along the journey that they take. It's not only refugees who avail themselves of those services. So if there is a risk of a terrorist organization trying to infiltrate a country through crossing borders illegally, they're going to access the same people. And that's what we call mixed migration. You're going to have economic migrants, you're going to have refugees, and who knows whoever has the money to try to get across. So that vulnerability is in the system. However, once again, you don't find the people who've committed acts of terrorism in the US that have crossed in that way. The people who've actually committed acts of terrorism, including in 9/11, were actually here through the legal system of migration. And so nobody wants to risk their lives or take that journey that refugees take or asylum seekers take if they don't have to. And so there's plenty of other ways to access our country that often people will find. So we need as a country to have a sense of security, that we're not just letting in anybody, including criminal elements. The reality is there are people stirring up a sense that we're not secure when in fact we are, if we look at acts of terrorism committed in this country, and especially at the refugee situation. So there's been a lot of misunderstanding built around that. There's also ways, if you read The Economist, this week's issue, I think it was August 28th issue or whatever, they have a phenomenal 3-page article just on what countries can do so that the people in the country feel secure while the country demonstrates respect for human rights of people to seek asylum. There are ways forward. Part of it is we just have to get rid of the false fears that are prevailing right now in our system.
So would it be fair to say if your intent in coming to the U.S. is to do harm, it's probably far easier for you to get a visa and come in legally than to come in through the refugee or the asylee system?
Oh yeah, it's way safer, and that's what's happened. You come in on a student visa and overstay, or you come in on some other way. That's how things happen.
Yeah.
So, here just a real politically charged comment that will certainly get people talking, but there's a long history of governments that have identified a very vulnerable segment of the population as dangerous. And none of those are governments that we would respect today. It's an old ploy to make somebody who's really vulnerable into a supervillain and then demonstrate how strong you are by protecting your people from those vulnerable people. And I think we have to be very, very careful in our day and age to not allow the rhetoric of the media or the politicians to identify vulnerable people as people we should be afraid of.
Yeah, but it's a very accurate statement. If you look back, the Nazis demonized the Jews. In Rwanda before the genocide, they demonized the Tutsis. So yeah, that often is the precursor to some kind of oppression or even violence against people.
Yeah. So whenever somebody does go down that path, we better at least have some serious question marks over what is the agenda here and why are they picking on the most vulnerable people?
Yeah, absolutely. So in closing, is there anything perhaps that we haven't touched on that you think would be important that you would like our students to know about?
I always have something more to say. But I think you've covered a lot of really good stuff. I'm glad that this class is going to have hopefully a very robust conversation about forcibly displaced people. I'm sorry that we're in a post-2015 world where suddenly refugees have become an issue of national security rather than an issue of humanitarian concern. Until 2015, I do not remember a government talking about refugees as a threat. This is all very new, and I think that's really important to hold in your conversation together. The other thing I would say is to, and now I'm having a senior moment. Back in the 80s, when I was working with refugees, they were fleeing communist countries. So these were mostly white people fleeing from European countries that were under the domination of communism. So every refugee who came to the West had political value. So we could put those people in the face of Russia and say, look, your people are fleeing. That's how bad it is there. You can't tell us you're better than we are. And so we could actually process people fleeing communist countries. When I first started, it took 3 months or 4 months by the time they hit a refugee camp to the time they were in the US rebuilding their lives. The slowdown happened right after 1994. And that's when the Iron Curtain fell, and the Iron Curtain had fallen, and people were reassessing what to do about refugees. There was also, at the very end of the Cold War, there was a big flood of refugees into Europe. The US was actually resettling tons of people from Europe at that time, from refugee camps. But when the Iron Curtain fell, the refugees lost their political value in the world, and suddenly nobody wanted to help them. And even though it had always been stated as this is something we do because of human rights, I suspect that there was a strong another agenda that was making everybody say, bring them on. We're thrilled about these people. They're heroes. They're not a threat. And again, they're coming from countries that we've identified as a threat. So now after 1994 really is when it started, the African and Central Asians and stuff, they started to come into refugee camps, and they did not have that same political value. And that shifted everybody's response. And suddenly people said, well, we can't take all these people. The other thing I think would be really interesting for people to read about is the US response to the boat people in the 70s in the early 80s from Vietnam and at the end of the war, and how many people came from Asia at that time to the US and how many resettled and how well those communities are doing today. The Hmong community as well. There's a lot of these communities that came in as refugees that are doing quite well today. And we need to keep that perspective when people today say, well, they're too different from us, or, you know, they may have a bad agenda and stuff. We have a robust history in this country of welcoming people who were forced to flee their homes, giving them a place, and quite often these people become the biggest patriots in the country. They're so thankful that we gave them a place. By denying people who are running for their lives, by denying them safety, we're not making friends. And we're not, even generationally, the story that is going to be told is at our darkest moment, in our time of deepest need, they put up a wall. They pulled up the gates. They mobilized their military to stop us from finding safety. That's not a story I want generations to hear.
Yeah. I think those are great points and important to keep in mind. You know, if you think about it, these are people who place such value on being here in the US that they risk their lives to get here. You know, these are people who are going to embrace our culture and society and become really valuable members of society. I interviewed a woman who's working with asylees in Arizona, and she refers to them as the cream of the crop.
Yeah.
Yeah, that these are people who, through strength of faith and strength of their commitment to their families, risk their lives to have more opportunity.
Yeah. I have friends in refugee camps that I wish were my neighbors here in Minneapolis. I even know a guy named Muhammad, of all things, from Somalia, who's been given a full ride to Princeton University if he can just find a way into this country. But we have a travel ban. He's a refugee, fled for his life. He's a brilliant guy. English is fluent. He's doing all kinds of great stuff inside of the refugee camp context. Princeton somehow found out about him, and they're offering him a full ride. And the only thing against him is the political will to let him in. And I'm thinking, wow, isn't this the kind of guy we want telling the story about how I was a stranger and you invited me in? You gave me place when place had been ripped away from me. You gave me the ability to develop my skills to make a difference in this world for good. If we don't let him in, that's not, the story's going to be the opposite. And that is not a good investment in the future of our world. And he's one life, but there's a whole bunch of these people out there. These refugees are not just, some of them are people who maybe don't have a degree or didn't get to college and stuff, but many of these people are lawyers and journalists and nurses and doctors and all, you know, they come from every walk of life. They had to flee because they weren't safe. So I'd love them to see place restored. A displaced person cannot fully recover until place has been restored.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point to end with. This was really great, Tom. I really value your expertise and your ministry, and you know that I really like the work you do and think it's so important. And just really, again, want to thank you for taking the time to do this. We'll be having that robust conversation. I think this will be engaging, and look forward to seeing where it goes from here.
That's great. And if anybody feels a call to go out there and work, let me know.
Okay. And in fact, they can find you through your website, IAFR.org.
That's it. Go there. We got a deal for you. Thanks, David. Thanks for all you do, man.
Yeah.
God bless.
Well, thank you. We'll be in touch.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See ya.